I think what a lot of clinicians maybe don't understand about shame is that generally the more severe and significant the developmental trauma a person has experienced, the deeper their shame, the deeper their self-hatred. Again, they needed, as children, to try and make sense out of a world that they were born into that didn't make any sense to them, except that there's something wrong with them. That basic sense, that there is something defective and alien and just basically wrong with them. And that's the roots, part of the roots of shame.
Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the Complex Trauma Training Center. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. And now for our interview. Dr. Laurence Heller is a clinical psychologist, international teacher, and the developer of the NeuroAffective Relational Model, an approach designed to address complex and developmental trauma. With over 4 decades of experience, his work integrates Gestalt therapy, somatic experiencing, and psychodynamic psychotherapy to deepen how early trauma is understood and treated. He is the co-founder of the NARM Training Institute, a senior fellow at the Meadows, and co-author of Healing Developmental Trauma and the Practical Guide for Healing Developmental Trauma. His upcoming book, Healing Shame and Guilt, continues his commitment to bringing a more human and compassionate perspective to mental health. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Laurence Heller. All right, I'm joined today by Dr. Laurence Heller. So happy to have you on Transforming Trauma.
Nice to be here. Nice to be back.
Yeah, welcome back. So I'd love to hear, your intention maybe for today, what you'd like our listeners to come away with from our conversation.
As you know, I've got a new book coming out on shame and guilt, co-written with Stefan Niederwieser, one of my German teachers. And we wrote the book because shame and guilt are an interesting topic to many people and useful and important. So I'd love to be able to share more of some of the perspective that we present in the book and, just the overall theme about shame and guilt to go into a little more depth than maybe we've been able to do in the past.
Fantastic. Well, with that, where would you like to start?
I think there are going to be several areas that we're going to be talking about. But there's a hidden dimension that we talk about in the book. I'm kind of jumping ahead a little bit. A hidden dimension of shame and guilt, and particularly shame, has to do with all of the things that we don't do in our lives, how we narrow our lives in order to avoid the possibility of feeling shame. And that's a kind of a hidden, as I said, a hidden dimension. And it might be useful for people to reflect on all the things that maybe they have not tried, all the expressions that to loved ones or to other people that they don't communicate because they're afraid they might feel too vulnerable, and from that leading to feeling ashamed. So shame is life-limiting in a variety of ways that are not fully understood. And that was one of the intentions of the book, is to get some of that understanding out there, as well as, I'm sure we'll get into this, just how shame functions in our life, how it develops, and so on.
And I'm curious for you, because as you're bringing up shame, I know that in NARM, the understanding of shame-based identifications and shame, I get the sense it's more as a process, a verb. And I wonder if you could share with our listeners, kind of starting from there.
Yeah, I think that's actually a very important distinction that we make in NARM, which is that, and the other thing is that I think shame is often in various, even professional literature, is called an emotion. And very clearly, I don't believe that shame is an emotion. I do believe it's a process. It's something that, it had survival value for us no matter how it developed, but some aspects of shame are things that we've directly taken in, messages about ourselves that we've taken in from significant others, parents, caregivers, even our culture, broader themes as well. So, and that's important, that kind of introjecting shame. Mm-hmm. But I think the distinction in NARM is that we see that it's also a way of adapting, and it had survival value for us as children that we've talked about in the past. And I know you've got a whole range of different, viewers in terms of their experience with NARM. But that it functions to protect the attachment relationship as a child. And, that's why it can't just be eliminated. And I guess the last point that I'm sure we'll get to here is that the sense of agency, that since it's a process and it's something that as adults, not as children, but as adults we do to ourselves, that creates possibilities for working with it that are, I think, more effective when we understand it through that lens.
Yeah, I remember, sitting in my first NARM training, however many years ago, and learning this idea that shame had a function, and it just blew my mind. I remember feeling a bit disoriented about it, and even in working with clients sometime, as I kind of set that on the table to consider, a lot of times what I'm told is, I'm not trying to do this. This isn't something I'm doing to myself. And I wonder how you work with that. I've found kind of some different ways and sort of inroads in with different clients, but I'm curious, kind of in a general way, if you could share with our audience, kind of where you might start there.
So, what I would say to your client is, I know that you didn't start this process, but what I'm here to do is help you see how you continue, even,
Mm-hmm.
Unknowingly, to shame yourself in the present moment. So, it's based on the understanding that we have in NARM that agency is the opposite of shaming ourselves. It's a way
Right.
actually of seeing our part in any of the emotional or relational difficulties that we experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And I think, I think there's probably lots of things going on for clients, obviously, when we're in those moments.
And, to be really practical and on a clinical level, I would say, I would address the question with another question. Are you Are you thinking that I'm actually criticizing or shaming you right now, or
Hmm.
blaming you? Because that's not what's going on for me at all, just the opposite.
Hmm.
So it's that relational piece in NARM of really explaining where I'm coming from, but also asking a question, making their comments a part of the exploration that we're doing together, which is a very
Yeah.
important piece that NARM therapists learn how to do, hopefully, over time.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think it brings something up for me because I'm even just thinking how there might be times that our own shame as therapists can kind of be in the mix. And I wonder, even just from that as a jumping off place, can you talk a little bit about that? How our shame might impact the client?
Several aspects really to your question. One is that, and I'll address this one first, which is that for us as therapists, it's obviously very important to have done the significant work on our own shame and self-shaming dynamics that we have in order to be able to better perceive and then better work with the self-shaming that our adult clients are doing to themselves.
Hmm.
So, it is part of a countertransference dynamic that goes on all the time. Just in terms of how it can affect the process, is that often we feel hurt if the client isn't making the progress, quote unquote, that
Hmm.
we think that they should be. And sometimes we'll blame ourselves or shame ourselves about that. I'm not a good enough therapist. Sometimes the opposite is true, or the counter is true, which is we'll blame our clients. Oh, they're resistant. I mean, and that's built into the psychotherapy cake
Right.
too. We've traditionally often blamed clients for their quote unquote resistance, which, as you know, is not a word we use in NARM.
Hmm. Yeah, there's so much there, like you said. It's really rich, and acknowledging, yeah, when I'm sure, obviously, when you're working with therapists, that so many of us have a training in school, that it makes it really taboo to talk about our own shame and our own countertransference. So I just appreciate you, yeah,
Well,
bringing that up.
it wasn't always true, but it certainly is
Hmm.
true these days, and particularly when graduate students are now primarily getting CBT as their main
Hmm.
focus. The kind of depth understanding is slowly diminishing,
Yeah.
and for us as a field, that's unfortunate.
Can you talk a little bit? Because what came to mind as you were saying that just now. Like a lot of therapists come to a training, like a NARM training, with a lot of top-down kind of skills and familiar with working in that way. Can you speak to the bottom-up, work and how you bring that together with the top-down?
On the one hand, there's just helping people learn how to pay attention, not only to both their emotional experience as well as their physical experience, because we're constantly getting feedback from our emotions and from our body. Sometimes we listen to that, often we don't, and when we don't, we're really cutting off connection to our deeper selves. So that in itself is an important piece. And again, as you know, having done the training, is that in NARM, I see the body as the mechanism of disconnection. And we all know that instinctively. We know that when we hold our breath or tighten our muscles or we go into collapse, for example, that's a way of disconnecting from disconnecting from feeling our body, disconnecting from feeling our emotions. And paying attention to that bottom up work is essential, because otherwise we're just kind of lost in concepts and and ideas. And we all have had the experience that we know something in our head, but it doesn't change. That doesn't change our behavior. It doesn't change our feelings about ourselves or the world or whatever the dynamic is going on. And that embodiment piece, which is, come more to the light in recent years, the importance of embodiment, but that's always been a part of NARM for even before it was called NARM. In my earlier work, that embodiment piece was always a significant element. And then, of course, the other bottom up piece is the fourth pillar, where every shift towards increasing connection with self and others or something greater than ourselves, the client's attention is brought to that, and an invitation to anchor whatever that awareness is, to anchor it on a bodily level, because that's one of the deepest levels of knowing that we have. So there is this bottom up component, but where it's different from a lot of other bottom up methods is that we know that we can't use regulation techniques to regulate shame away, to regulate low self-esteem away, to regulate self-hatred away. It just doesn't work.
So I'm curious, going back to your book, I'm curious where you would go next in terms of sharing with us the work that you're putting out.
The book is really in two parts. Maybe 3/4 of the book is really for non-clinicians, for people to be able to use the various elements of the book to help them understand and really work with, and maybe even in some cases work through some of their struggle with shame. And when I say shame, I mean that whole continuum of shame, self-rejection, et cetera, things that I've mentioned already just a little bit earlier. And then the last, maybe, I don't know, third of the book, approximately, something like that, is for clinicians. And we've tried to make it, readable for the general public, but we specifically address for clinicians how they can begin to integrate this understanding in their clinical work. So it's a slightly different shift in audience from some of the previous books.
Mm-hmm. And that's so exciting. I'm so excited that the general public will be able to really access this and have this really vital education that I think is at least in here in America, I feel like that's not as much a part of our culture. Although shame is talked a lot about, the way that you hold it is so important, and I'm really excited for everyone to have access to this.
Well, thanks.
So in terms of how you're writing the book, you said the first chunk is for pretty much anyone to read it, and then there's more that you go more into depth. Can you talk a little bit more about that and what you're sharing with therapists there?
We go really not only into the kind of a deeper developmental understanding. We give the broad view for the general public, but there we go into, not everybody in the general public knows about adverse childhood experiences, for example, just to use one thing. So we go into the last part of the book with the orientation that we can address themes like the impact of ACEs as part of developmental trauma, for example?
Mhm.
And then what are the implications for therapy about, understanding that? And we bring, a lot of the clinical understanding of NARM and how to use that specifically towards themes of shame and guilt. And really, guilt is a simpler topic. It's not nearly as pervasive or pernicious, really, as shame, although it can still be quite crippling for some people.
Sure.
But we put more focus on how to work with shame and the protective function that shame served for us as children, and how, as clinicians, understanding that makes such a huge difference in how effective we can be in our interventions with clients who are struggling with their own shame. And they often clients don't realize the level of shame that they're carrying. I mean, we as clinicians have often heard how, the client comes in, they start talking about themselves, and you can just hear the self-loathing that is kind of out of their awareness. They're not, if you ask them, you know, are you really angry at yourself right now, or something along those lines? And we wouldn't
Mhm.
ask that specific question, but in that direction, they say, no, no. But when we if we just ask a question, for example, do you notice what is going on in your tone of voice and the attitudes that you're communicating to yourself right now? Again, there's a more cognitive question than I would ask
Yeah.
clinically, but in that direction.
Yeah, I appreciate you naming that. That so often there's no awareness, and we can really feel it and hear it, and
Uh,
feel it in the room. It can feel so thick, and then there's no when we kind of get curious about that. There's kind of a real disconnect of like, no, I don't know what you're talking about.
Mhm. At
So
first,
yeah.
at first, that's common.
Hmm.
And, I think what a lot of clinicians maybe don't understand about shame is that it's not an absolute principle, but generally, the more severe and significant the developmental trauma a person has experienced, the deeper their shame, the deeper their
Yeah.
self-hatred. Again, they needed, as children, to try and make sense out of a world that they were born into that didn't make any sense to them, except that there's something wrong with them. That basic sense, that there is something defective and alien and just basically wrong with them. And
Yeah.
that's the roots, part of the roots of shame.
From that place, I'm curious where you'd like to take us.
Any conversation on shame wouldn't be complete if we don't address the theme of sexuality. Now,
Mm,
that's one of many themes in the book, but we spend some significant time on shame and sexuality. And this shame about sex and bodies too
right.
gets communicated through the family, but it's a cultural dynamic that is much broader than any given individual, because we all grew up in cultures that are in some ways unfriendly or shaming, or all kinds of other emotional dynamics around sex and sexuality, and we know how important it is, sexuality, as human beings. As they say on Madison Avenue, sex sells. But that's often the flip side, the way we overfocus on, we're surrounded by all kinds of sexual imagery these days, in our country, in many countries these days, and the popularity of porn and other things. It speaks to how fundamental and how significant sexuality is to us as human beings, and the deep conflicts that we feel about our own sexuality, our own sexual desires, our own sexual fantasies, all of those elements. And so in the book, it's a very important topic that we spend some significant time on.
I'm so excited to read that section. I've, again, working with clients, that's another area where I find often I feel it so thick in the room that there's so much that they're holding around their sexuality and how they relate to themselves and sort of their shame around maybe their bodies. And again, there's often a real disconnect that they they can't see that. Again, maybe how they grew up, there might be different systems in play that have impacted and shaped how they relate to themselves and their sexuality and their body. And so it's a real tender space, I find, to navigate with a client. So I'm just so excited to read more of your work on that. That's really exciting.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Yeah. So you talk about sexuality. What other, dynamics or what other things around shame are you bringing to the world in this book?
Again, the distinction, one is that it's a process. Two, that it's protective. Three, that it impacts us in ways that we don't fully understand. And I think also there's a complexity there that we try, my co-author and I try to tease apart and take, kind of like one step at a time, just kind of like we do when we're exploring dynamics with clients, holding the deep interconnectedness of all these themes of shame and guilt, but then taking them in ways that are not abstract, but are very specific, helping both the individual who's struggling with shame and the clinician who's trying to help them deal with their struggles.
Yeah, I don't know. There's something about maybe that's coming up for me. And again, I'm just thinking about working with clients, and I have a few clients in particular kind of in mind right now as we're talking about this. I'm wondering how you can help bring what often feels so implicit about shame, and maybe my mind's going back to some of the sexual shame and shame around body, and even like roles in families. I've recently had a lot of clients sort of feel a lot of shame around kind of a role that they played in the family, the dynamics that were playing out. And I'm curious, when there is sort of a disconnect and like a not connecting with that or having a real awareness of it, how do you name it in a way that, again, doesn't like spur more shaming or self-shaming? Does that land? Does that make sense?
We don't try and avoid those things that might spur more self-shaming. We just make that a part of the process too. So, for example, we might say, as we're talking about this, I'm just wondering I'm talking to a client now. I'm just wondering what's going on. And if they have some capacity for self-reflection, self-awareness, they say, I'm actually feeling worse about this now, or something like that. But to go back to your first question, I think it's always working through what a client is wanting, the first pillar, obviously, what the client is wanting and the obstacles that are in the way of them having whatever they're most wanting for themselves in their lives. We don't have to work hard to make the implicit explicit. The implicit is trying to become explicit all the time.
Right.
It's just that it gets distorted through the theme of shame and other related kinds of themes in such a way that it isn't obvious to the client. And so instead the client becomes symptomatic. So the symptoms that they're experiencing, and obviously that are painful and they want to get rid of, that's the way that the implicit is making itself known in the therapeutic process itself. So again, we don't have to go on an archaeological dig with the client to find it. If we're there really present, paying attention, we'll start to see it. And then we ask questions that help it surface. And then we work with the internal obstacles that the client is carrying. Like, for example, one of the obstacles that we run into all the time is they start to get afraid. Well, that's a really important thing that, as you know, we follow in NARM. We might say, for example, what's the scariest thing about, and then whatever it is that the fear has been, the context in which the fear came on.
I appreciate you describing that. I think there's part of, and again, I'm thinking of, some specific moments for me. And this is where I just am so appreciative of the NARM model, because sometimes I'm not really sure what the territory is. Like you're saying, I feel it so present. The implicit is trying to make itself explicit. I have a sense. And I don't always know. In fact, usually I don't really know what it is that's emerging, and just creating that space.
You don't have to know. You don't have to know.
Yeah.
The very fact that you know that there, or you at least sense at least, that
Mhm.
something very important is starting to come up, that in itself gives you an entryway.
Mhm.
And we can have working hypotheses, for example, about
Mhm.
what it might be, but that's where the inquiry process in NARM is so effective.
Yeah.
Then we just begin an inquiry, asking questions based on a working hypothesis. And the very fact that it's a hypothesis means that with no new information, we can change that hypothesis
Mhm.
if the direction of the client's responses is taking us a different direction. So, one of the things that I hope that every NARM therapist has experienced is that using NARM takes so much of the work and the pressure off of
Mhm.
ourselves, in terms of, because we trust in a very deep way, we trust the process, and we trust that if we're staying present and relatively attuned, that the emergency will emerge. What is
Mhm.
implicit will become explicit in a way that people really, and I know you've experienced that, but people sometimes have to see it or experience it to really see how powerful it can be.
Yeah, I'm thinking of one session in particular. And what's interesting or what felt different to me in this session is actually what what was implicit and was made more explicit was her experience, but it wasn't actually like memories or anything that came up. She didn't have, in fact, in a way, she kind of was like, I kind of feel like my brain actually doesn't want me to remember some of this, but she was able to process through a lot of what was coming up for her, and she kind of made that more explicit. It was a really interesting moment for me, a real learning opportunity to be with her in that space. And again, the model just created so much spaciousness to be able to experience that. But I think it was related to shame. A lot of it was, and from what she said. And so I really appreciate you kind of describing that, because we as clinicians may not always, at least I didn't see it coming.
Well, I get struck by several things that you mentioned. One is, and I hear this all the time, which is a reflection of a lack of agency when they say my brain, as if it's
Mm,
some kind of independent creature there. My
mhm,
brain is not wanting me to hear. But see,
mhm,
that's where my interest is piqued,
mm,
because that's the symptom. And I might say, and I would never use the brain in that say, but what is it that your mind, and I shift it to mind,
mhm,
what is it that your mind, or no, I wouldn't put it quite that directly. I'd say, I'm just curious about that. You're telling me that your brain, or what I would call your mind, is really not wanting you to know something about
mhm,
yourself right now. And
mm,
I'm wondering if maybe there's something. Is there something? No, I would ask it as a question. Is there something scary or frightening there
mhm,
that you're aware of? And then so that moment by moment kind of like she or he or they
mhm.
were telling you something very important about their process, and we're not trying to get to the memory that
Right.
that person believed their brain was trying to stop, but
Mhm,
work with the process of self-censoring, pushing parts of ourselves away that this person was communicating to you in that moment. And that's a kind of a process-oriented dynamic. I think that it comes really only after some time, or at least for many people, takes some time in the NARM
yeah.
training to get more fluent on that level.
Mhm. So, yeah, and what else in the book? We're kind of giving our audience some teasers so they can know what to look forward to.
I touched on something earlier on in our broadcast. I'll go back to that because I think it's important. So often, we think of shame as just like dark secrets, and of course, sometimes it is that way. But there can be so much shame about loving.
Mm,
When I made a comment early on that the things that we don't say to people, how we narrow our lives, for example,
yeah.
that um, we're afraid, like if we tell somebody who we actually feel loving feelings for, that for some people to communicate that opens up the possibility of rejection. Well, that person might not feel the same way. And then, the fear of rejection, what, we would then explore if they use the word rejection. Well, what are you afraid of? Ultimately leads back to shame. they'll reject me. They won't like me. Then I'll hate myself for having said it, and the vicious cycles that people get into around trying to, avoid shame or avoid the reactions to communicating love, which leads to vulnerability. And all of these elements are all ultimately connected. And so we help take this kind of string that's all knotted up, and we help them unravel it for themselves.
Yeah. I love that image. That's one I use often.
Mhm.
It does kind of feel like that. And I've even had clients say, kind of the organizing process. It's like untangling a
Mhm.
ball of yarn or something.
Mhm.
So that's a really useful image. Right now in this moment, I'm noticing my body's kind of having a sort of a settling as you're sharing with us
Mhm.
more of these points. And I'm wondering for you, is there anything that you would like me to ask? Anything that you would hope our, listeners could hear you kind of expound on?
Let's talk about shame and identity,
Mm,
because obviously the role of shame in the development of our what we take to be our identity, and that includes, of course, the 5 survival styles, which often, you know, is what we end up taking to be our identity. That the basis of much of who we have taken ourselves to be is shame based. And the more trauma that we've experienced, the more shame based they tend to be. The more trauma we've experienced, or the more trauma that we've worked through, our sense of self becomes increasingly less shame based. But if we go through the 5 survival styles, we can look at the role of shame right there, and that's and the all the identity and the coping mechanism, the survival strategies that we developed around there. So, connection survival styles feel shame at existing. Attunement
yeah.
survival styles feel shame at needing. Trust survival styles feel shame at being vulnerable, about depending on people, about, you know, trusting, and all of those elements. Autonomy survival styles, individuals struggle with feeling shame and guilt about saying no or setting limits. And love sexuality, individuals tend to feel shame in terms of often their physical appearance, but
Mhm.
basing their self-esteem on how they look and how they perform. That in itself is because underneath that, there's all this shame. If I don't perform well, I'm worthless. If I see a flaw on my physical being, then I'm ugly. I mean, and I've worked with so many traditionally very attractive people, and when they look in the mirror, all they see are the defects. That's all shame. That's, expressing itself in a whole variety of ways that they don't, at the beginning of their process anyway, don't even recognize that they're
Mhm.
shaming themselves. But again, they were often shamed for the same things that they shame themselves. Not always, but there does obviously tend to be
Mhm.
a common ground there.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate and for anyone who hasn't been through a NARM training, these concepts and the 5 survival styles, I just remember being in my training, my first training, and um, I think I've heard you name it before. I know I've heard Brad name it. This idea of like shaming myself for shaming myself. And so as I was learning about the survival styles and starting to notice, oh, I experienced this, and there were multiple, styles that I sort of resonated with. And that was a really interesting couple of modules for me, kind of in real time processing my own experience around that, learning. Was a really rich experience, but it was definitely hard. And I imagine that our clients would experience something too, as we're in that way
Yeah,
when we're talking
I
about it.
think that's inevitably happens to some
Hmm.
degree or another, and
Hmm.
and then again, we we just reflect that back to them. We
Yeah.
help them see. So, and sometimes, as you've probably seen in my videos and my workings and stuff, that
Hmm.
I'll use irony, for example, to help them see. Like, I say, so now you're telling yourself you're bad for having told yourself that you're bad.
Hmm.
And I put it in that kind of tone of voice, like, so they start to see, hopefully it supports a certain kind of disidentification process, helps them to distance themselves from this way of being with themselves that has been really painful for them. And by bringing it into a kind of clearer focus and with a little bit more uh, adult consciousness, embodied adult, consciousness, as we talk about it in NARM.
Yeah. I so appreciate you highlighting that, because that certainly has been my own experience, just speaking from my own experience. I don't think I had much of a sense, starting the training. First of all, I thought it was just a training. I didn't realize it was going to really change my whole life in that way. But I remember, the first time I even heard the word disidentification, it was like a light bulb went on of, oh, this is an experience of mine. This isn't necessarily who I am.
Mhm.
And disidentifying from some of these patterns, it made it more accessible. I got excited, even though at the same time I was simultaneously having the experience of shaming myself for shaming myself, all of that kind of in one big ball. But that was so exciting to me, this concept of I can disidentify. That's actually not who I am. And so that, like you're saying, how related that is to shame, and yeah, how important that process is.
And often in one way or another, particularly when I'm writing, I've used this expression, which I'll share with you and the viewers, that helps people begin that disidentification process, at least on a cognitive level at first. But it's a first step, which is, and I think it leads in the new book, written with Stefan, a quote from me. I quote myself, but basically it goes something like, most of the shame that we feel has nothing to do with who we are.
Mm,
It's a paraphrase because I can't quote. I don't know. I don't
mhm.
remember exactly how I wrote it in there, but
Yeah.
that's a really important thing to realize, is that often those things that we were overtly shamed for example, were really, and we don't use this as a substitute for the work that needs to be done, but really, we shame ourselves because, or as an adaptation to having been shamed ourselves
Mm,
by, let's say, by our parents, and they pass on shame that they learned from their parents. And really, there's this big intergenerational element to this self-shaming piece, and that's
yeah.
particularly true in the area of sexuality and bodies, because
Right.
there's been a long-standing tradition in Western culture, in particular, other cultures as well. We're not alone there, but in rejecting the body and in feeling that sexuality in itself is dirty and bad. So
Right.
it's useful to begin to that disidentification process, and we build it in clinically in a whole variety of ways without ever talking about it cognitively, because we know the limitations of cognitive interventions.
Hmm. Yeah, that's again, I'm so appreciating you highlighting this. There's like a generational sort of passing down often, this messaging and this experience of self shaming, and that's just so important. And I'm excited to read more about how you shared that
Mm.
in the book.
Well, as you probably know, the book will be out in a couple of months now, so it's
Great.
getting, the time is getting close.
Great. Yeah, very excited. Very excited. Is there anything else as we move to closing that you'd like to make sure we speak to?
I guess maybe the last piece is the whole theme of vulnerability and shame.
Hmm.
That it's does bring up a lot of vulnerability as we start to explore these, what had been, you know, previously hidden dynamics that relate to the really very painful elements of who we have taken ourselves to be, that again have nothing to do with who we actually are, but we've tended to believe that, whatever those messages were, or however we used the self-shaming as an adaptation to protect the attachment relationship, for example. That's a major part of the adaptation. That there's this expansion and this vulnerability that comes as we slowly disidentify or shed these layers of shame, self-shaming, self-rejection, self-hatred. But the payoff for all that is how much energy we have that is bound up in these self-shaming dynamics, and to make that available, increase that energy available to people increasingly, so that they can use it for loving and relationships and creativity and fun and all the things that life can be. It's just important to understand this, that with all of that does come, an increasing, diminishing sense of the control and the need to control, and an increasing sense of vulnerability, because the reality as human beings is that we are vulnerable. And if we run away from that, we're running away from, part of the human experience and part of our own personal experience.
Yes. Yes, and expanding our capacity for that vulnerability has been, again, I can only speak from my own experience, but how rich that is, how supportive that is, how exciting that is. It's kind of like there's moments where I feel some expansion, and it's like I can see it on the horizon, and I'm leaning into it, and it's just so exciting. And anyway, so I just really appreciate how you speak to that, and excited for the book. And
yeah, I hope that you read the book. I hope that it helps you with your own process of shaming. Remember, you're not alone with this shaming dynamic. We all struggle and have struggled with the themes of shame and self-shaming. So it's good to bring that to the light, and find a different way of being with ourselves and being with others in the world, with increasingly less shame.
yeah. Well, thank you so much. So glad and grateful that you made the time to be here with us, and excited for the book. Do you have the exact date when it emerges?
May 12th.
May 12th.
Yeah, and it's little plug here. It's
Mhm.
available for pre-order on
Oh,
Amazon and
fantastic.
others. Yeah,
Okay.
so anybody who's interested can order it right now.
Fantastic. I will hop on and get my copy. I'm very, very
Okay,
excited.
great.
Thank you, Larry.
Okay,
And
thanks, Emily Ruth. Good to see you again.
good to see you too.
Okay, bye, everyone.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more information about our guest, check the show notes or visit us at complextraumatrainingcenter.com/transforming trauma. If today's conversation resonated, our spring 2027 NARM therapist training is designed to help you expand what's possible in your trauma work. This live online program offers a structured, clinically grounded way to build more precision, confidence, and effectiveness in treating complex trauma and adverse childhood experiences. If you're ready to strengthen your clinical impact and work with greater depth, we invite you to join us to get trained in the NeuroAffective Relational Model. Enrollment is now opened and space is limited. Visit complextraumatrainingcenter.com to learn more and apply.